I'm at a point in my life where the only income that I'm generating is the income that I generate. I don't currently have a contract for a bigger entity where I provide a service to them, as a host or an MC or writing something or a consultant or whatever. The money that pays our mortgage, the money that keeps our lights on, keeps the fridge full, keeps the sauna hot, money only comes if I work to make it happen. And I create the work to make it happen, essentially. So, what would you think happens then? Well, if I'm not careful, I can start to work way, way, way too much. Often I get very, very busy on things that do not bring in income. It's wild, isn't it? I feel like I'm working really, really, really hard and I'm very, very busy, but I'm actually getting less done. And if I'm not careful, I can get less productive right when I need to be more productive and right when I need to make sure the quality of what it is that I'm making is absolutely top notch. Once again, a wild revelation. I am not a special snowflake here. I'm not alone. It's quite a common situation. Thankfully, though, there are scientific ways of approaching productivity, methods that we can use to make sure that we're doing more good work in less time and therefore giving us free time to recharge, recoup, reflect, and perhaps just, I don't know, sit there, just think, do nothing. So that when we're back on the tools, we come back with a fresh perspective, fresh ideas, and an ability to produce higher quality work than if we're up at 3 in the morning trying to finish a deadline. My guest today is a world-renowned expert in such things, a world-renowned expert in productivity. Dr. Ali Abdaal spent a few years working in the NHS in the UK as a doctor before leaning full-time into the videos that he was making, initially to help other med students pass their exams and then growing out into a larger offering around essentially making sure your work ethic matches your values and that those two things are aligned. He's a truly fascinating man. His YouTube is epic. His latest book, it's a New York Times bestseller, is called Feel Good Productivity. It's lovely to see you. How are you today, mate?
I'm doing pretty good. This is nice. I love your setup. It's a good vibe. I was serenaded by you singing just now, which was very nice. So it's a good start to the morning.
I have a history of being a roadie back in the day before broadcast came into it. So mic checks get very boring if it's just 1 2 1 2. So you got to sing every now and again.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I do the same thing.
We were going to speak a couple of months ago, and then one of your team of people said, "Look, he's very busy making this enormously fantastic book." And fair call. And you've been working very, very hard on this. It's a cracker. But what I do kind of love is the how much doctoring, how much medicine, I guess, the thing that brought you to being a doctor, how much of that is in this book?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of it, really. There was a lot more of it, but then we had to cut out quite a lot of mentions of it because my publisher said that too many examples from life as a doctor will make it unrelatable to most people in the audience. So we had to sort of tone it down a little bit.
Oh,
But really, like a big part of why I discovered this whole like feel good productivity philosophy and stuff was because I was working for 2 years in a real job that required me to like, you know, go to work and do the work and come home and work nights and weekends and stuff. Um, and I think that sort of almost real world experience helped really set the stage for a lot of my own theories and stuff about productivity. Because yeah, I mean, if I were a full-time entrepreneur where I could do whatever I want, then in a way, like my productivity advice, runs the risk of not really being applicable to normal people and only really applicable to entrepreneurs. Nowadays, it's I'm kind of a full-time entrepreneur and author and stuff. And so like the stuff that I think about and talk about and the way I schedule my life and stuff now only really appeals to other entrepreneurs and other authors. So I'm kind of glad that I had those 2 years of like life in the real world to be able to appreciate how annoying it is having a real job.
Certainly, as someone who's been, a junior doctor working in the NHS in the UK, both my parents did that at one point. I'm an immigrant, but I'm white, so no one cares here in Australia. But they met in the UK. One came from here after leaving rubble of Europe, and the other one came from Prague after leaving the rubble of same Russians, a couple of years apart. And they told stories of literally finding a spare bed in pal care ward and went, well, I'm going to lie down here for 5 minutes. And I'm wondering, is it still like that?
It kind of is. On a night shift, when you're bringing patients in to the emergency department, you have to you're mandated to take a half an hour break every 4 hours, and so you'll go to the doctor's common room. You'll try and find an empty sofa where no one else is sleeping, and try and sort of sleep for 25 minutes to do a bit of a power nap. I had one placement on psychiatry that was very nice because on night shifts they gave you a room, um, and and so I would bring my own blanket and my own fan because it would be quite hot in that room because this was over the summer, and it was pretty nice. And then the nurses would bleep you, and you'd wake up and go and see a patient and come back and sleep. So it's kind of nice once in a while.
Yeah, I guess there's a number of people who are in the same space, in the productivity space, or ways to make your life working better space. Certainly on YouTube, and certainly in the book world. But not many of those people have spent their hot summer nights, getting a phone call from a nurse and then going and trying to talk to someone who's having the worst fucking day of their life, convinced they're being eaten alive by snakes that live inside them and you can't see them, but they hurt like crazy. Um, what kind of perspectives does that give you to your work?
That's a good question. What kind of perspectives? I think one major perspective is it- it's going to sound cliche, but the whole um, there's that phrase that the healthy man has 100 problems or 100 desires. The unhealthy man has only one. And hospitals are really the great equalizer where, you know, we had patients who were kind of high flying CEOs. We had patients who were homeless. We had patients who were like from literally every walk of life imaginable. We had patients who were all in the same bed, in the same hospital, in the same state funded healthcare system. And it really kind of makes you appreciate that, holy shit, I really want to take care of my health, because quite a lot of them like were there for things where you could be like, this would have been preventable. Maybe they'd been smoking all their life, or they hadn't taken their diet and exercise seriously. But also, quite a lot of them were there for reasons completely outside of their control, like young people in their 30s and 40s having cancer randomly, or like it just really helps you appreciate that life is short and there are things that you can control about your health that are very useful to control, but also you don't have control over the whole thing.
You came to the UK when you were a kid with your brother, and you're living the immigrant story, right? Which is often the case with my parents were the same. My wife's parents were the same. She came from Fiji, in that the pathway here is education, kids. That's it. We don't know anyone. We've got no one that can do us favors. So let's just go. Was that something that was kind of drilled into you, or did you really, really want to be a doctor?
Mm. Yeah, so the education thing was very much drilled into me, that education is the most important thing. We moved to the UK when I was like 7, and previously I was born in Pakistan, and then we lived in southern Africa in Lesotho for like 6 years before coming to the UK. So education was really drilled in as being particularly important. Specifically medicine. My mum never really pushed me into doing it. She was like, "Hey, do what you want as long as you're good at it and as long as you can get a decent job." Um, but it was kind of weird because my mum was a doctor and all of our friends' parents were doctors. Medicine was really the only career that I knew existed. Everything else was,
Yeah.
if someone asked me, "Do you want to do history at university?" I'd be like, "Well, all you can do with that is become a history teacher." So I just didn't really appreciate that there were other feasible careers outside of medicine.
Yeah.
And so, in a way, I kind of went down that path somewhat randomly. I was torn between medicine and computer science, but I thought it's more interesting to be a doctor who knows how to code than it is to be a random dude who knows how to code. So I thought, why don't I do medicine? And then I can just keep up coding and learn web design and development and stuff on the side, because I was always kind of into that.
The work that you've done now in productivity, and a lot of your early success was in, I guess, helping university students with their productivity. I've had like my mate Pete went to Cambridge, and I've spent some time there. He was a research fellow there, and he told stories of just like full all nighters. Like that's the stuff. That's just what needed to be done when you were there. Did you notice like these? You're a kid. You go to university, and you've got the weight of your expectations on your shoulders. Did you notice people, I guess, burning out or putting themselves under an inordinate amount of pressure, and by working harder than they probably should have, they were doing themselves a disservice?
Yeah, quite a lot. So in my first 2 weeks, one of the medical students in my college dropped out, citing stress as the reason. In the first month, we had someone else drop out. In the first year, we had someone else drop out. Like the dropout rate was somewhat high. I realized that for me and for a lot of my friends, our entire identity was tied to this idea of being a high academic performer. And so when you're in school, it's like, great, you're a high academic performer and you feel like you're
Yeah.
winning. And the feeling like you're winning is a very addictive feeling in any walk of life. Then you get to university, you realize you're bang average. You no longer have that sensation of feeling like you're winning. And so you then feel like you have to work really, really, really hard and burn the midnight oil and stuff to get that feeling back, to get that identity back. For me, I tried that for a year. I was like, hey, I'm going to work really hard. And then I just realized pretty quickly that actually, um, in order for me to come anywhere near the top of the year, there are just not enough hours in the day for that. And there were just people who were just way more naturally intelligent than me, which was a bit of a humbling experience. So then I started thinking, okay, cool. What is the game that I actually want to be playing here? Like, do I want to be playing the get good grades at all costs game, or what's the point? And coincidentally, around that time, I discovered the 4 Hour Work Week by Tim Ferriss, and I realized that the game that I wanted to play was, hey, I'd love to be able to work part time someday. And the way you work part time in medicine is by having enough money outside that you don't need a full time salary. And so that was when I decided to set my focus to, I just need to get through med school and enjoy the journey along the way. But on the side, I'm going to try and build businesses and I'm going to try and make quote, passive income, because my theory was, well, if I can make a couple of grand a month from my side business, then it means I can do medicine for fun rather than purely because I need the money.
It's so fascinating because as a doctor, if you're, especially as a young doctor, if you're not trying to make all these literally life and death decisions at the same time as being stressed about money, you're probably going to be making better decisions anyway.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, once I started working, I found this quite a lot. Where, the NHS, like, morale is at an all-time low. Junior doctors are going on strike to campaign for their wages to be increased from £14 an hour to £17 an hour because of inflation and stuff. So doctors have had a sort of 28% pay cut if you take inflation into account over the last 10 years, and a lot of you know it was all kind of it's very demoralizing. Most of my friends are still doctors, and I don't know how they do it. But it's a pretty sort of high stress life when you feel like, a, the job is itself very stressful, and then b, you feel like you're not actually being paid enough money to be able to, for example, buy a house, or to be able to, for example, live in London or in a place that you really want to.
Yes, when the housing crisis comes for doctors, we're real cooked. Well, we might need to really have a think about what's going on. You spoke about when, and it's interesting because I certainly saw this in my own career and the kind of TV that I've worked on. When you've been the best at whatever it is your whole life, you have this way of looking at yourself. And when you're suddenly in a room full of people who are also the best, all you got left is who you are and how you go about things. And that, what you described earlier, is that constant kind of, I guess, reward system dopamine hit from, oh, I did a really good job again, here I go, is now suddenly gone. And the adulation of others, because, oh, look how smart Ali is, look at him go, is gone. So I understand why people would want to just turn the treadmill up and go for it to try and make that up. But um, what should we be doing instead when we find ourselves in that position?
Yeah. I remember at the time I read a really good blog post by Mark Manson. I think this was before his Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck book came out. It'd been like maybe 2015 or something. And it was around diversifying your identity. And I really vibe with that. That blog post helped me realize that my identity was entirely pegged to this academic stuff. And it's pretty helpful to diversify your identity and to have, obviously, in a dream world, if you were fully enlightened, your sense of self would be entirely, well, would be entirely gone. But if you're not enlightened, then your sense of self and self-worth would come entirely from within. But in the real world, a lot of us do peg some of our self-esteem to external things like accolades or career success or how cute are our kids or whatever the thing might be. And so Mark Manson advised diversifying your identity, finding sources of pride in your life that are not just one thing. So I realized for me that was the business stuff. I also started working as a semi-professional magician, where I would do like magic tricks and stuff at balls and parties and get paid for that. I also started like organizing events, like social events and things for like the Pakistan Society. And so like I had a few different sources of identity, so that when my academic pillar of identity completely crumbled because I was bang average, I could still feel like I was, I don't know, worth something in a problematic way because I had the business going for me, or I had the magic stuff going for me, or I was doing this website stuff on the side.
Just before we leave the doctor thing, because I think you've got quite a perspective from where you've come from, and you've still got lots of mates who are doing it quite actively. If you're an election year in the UK, we're like less than a year away from our next election here in Australia, and we have a very similar public health system. What do you think would it take, besides the money? What would it take to make being a doctor desirable again?
Ooh, yeah. I think one of the things that a lot of my friends talk about is just a little bit more autonomy, a little bit more freedom. Um, at the moment, a big part of why people are really burnt out by it is because it's genuinely it's just really hard to take time off. You have to like negotiate with the rota coordinator. One of my friends was getting married, and she emailed them like 9 months in advance to say that, hey, look, I'm getting married on the 18th of August. Can you please let me have that day off? And when the rota came out a month before, she found out that she was on a night shift on the 18th of August, on the day that she was getting married. And it's things like that that are not like the exception. They kind of happen fairly regularly. And so what a lot of my mates talk about is that, like, if we just had a little bit more autonomy, if there was just a little bit more flex in the system to allow us to take time off when we wanted to, rather than to have to sort of kind of beg, borrow, steal, swap shifts, all of this stuff. Because if you can take time off when you want, it means you can actually have a life. Obviously within the bounds of how much annual leave you're entitled to, but it means you can have a life. It means you can go on holiday with your mates when they're all going on holiday, rather than feeling as if you're stuck doing this thing where you're at the mercy of this admin person who's coordinating the rota. And I think in Cal Newport's book, So Good They Can't Ignore You, he talks a lot about this, that a big part of job satisfaction comes from your sense of autonomy in the job, how much control you feel you have over your life. And unfortunately, at least in medicine in the UK, you don't have a lot of that. And I think if we can find a way to give doctors and healthcare workers that sense of autonomy back, it would go some way towards helping things. Obviously, the money is also great. So yeah, that's probably it's a hard one to solve.
It is, especially where and it's the same thing here. The cost of the system starts to blow out when you're dealing with acute uh, presentations. Certainly, the work that I've done sitting on the boards of mental health charities and things, it's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yet trying to push for an early intervention program that costs money for people who are, everyone goes, look, they look fine, is really hard. But trying to make the economic argument. There's actually a, spend this money here now, and we won't be spending squillions up that end. It's only when we get to that end, and then we start cutting costs. And yeah, look, it's not a perfect system anywhere, but I lived in America 10 years. I'm very grateful we got it. I'm not going to lie. I'm
Yeah.
very, very lucky. It's a whole other world over there, man. We've got two kids at our house. One's 4.5, nearly 5. The other one's 20. She's at uni. She's killing it. But when you're speaking to students, what's the thing you tell them now? Like, not the kids that you were helping on the YouTube channel in the early days, but when you're speaking to students now, what's the thing that you tell them around a way to approach their work that encompasses the diversity of identity and trying to be a bit smarter about things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I speak to a lot of students now when I do talks and things. I think back in the day, maybe sort of like even 10 years ago, there was still the idea that, oh, I just need to do well at school so that I can get into a good university, and I just need to do well at university so that I can then get a good job. And then if I do well in my job, then I'll be able to sort of have a good life. I think increasingly, especially in the last 10 years, especially Gen Z, are kind of realizing that this is a bit of a myth. that they've been sold, and it's just not true. Maybe it was true at one point where the school, university, good job, good life, linear equation held true. But everyone, like a lot of students, realize now that cost of living has gone up everywhere. You probably won't be able to afford a house anytime soon. Whatever job you end up in, they can fire you whenever they want, as evidenced by the pandemic and how so many people lost their jobs. So there's a real sense of like this traditional system, this step by step thing of like get the good grades, get a good job, have a happy life. Just it doesn't hold true anymore, and so a lot of students feel very lost. Um, the best advice I've heard on this is actually from Cal Newport's blog, which I again used to read a lot and still do. But it really helped me get through university. And one thing that Cal Newport has always been bullish on is the idea of a lifestyle centric career planning. So instead of thinking, I've got a degree in economics, therefore, what career do I want to do? Or what job do I want? Do I go private equity? Do I go investment banking? Do I go consulting? Instead of doing that, you should say, hey, what is the life that I think I might want? What would I like my day to day experience of life to look like? Where might I want to live? How much autonomy over my schedule would I like? And now let's sort of reverse engineer what job makes sense based on that lifestyle. And generally, I find that most students don't do this. They tend to think, oh, I got an economics degree, or I like economics, therefore let me get the job. But they don't really realize until you get into the workplace that so much of your day to day experience and your day to day happiness depends on things like how good you feel at that job, how much autonomy you have, and just generally what does your day to day schedule look like. So I'm always a fan of beginning with the end in mind and figuring out what's the life you want, and then based on that, let's figure out what career or what job we can land into.
I have over my just through my interesting health history, where I'm 50, so I've met more doctors than you have, just because I'm old. Um, the orthopedic surgeons that I've spoken to heaps of them, but I settled on one guy in the end. But you kind of look at them, and I base them off my parents. They're kind of like the yardstick of like these two people that I had great integrity as to why they wanted to become doctors. And I'm like, you chose orthopedics as the quickest route to a Porsche, not because you wanted to help people. You can kind of tell.
Yeah, there's definitely a big aspect of status and prestige around certain specialties and certain careers as well, which is one way of choosing what you want to do with your life. But I don't think it's a particularly good one.
And now, because of the aforementioned housing crisis, many of these students, they're still living with their parents. What advice would you give to parents who are seeing these young adults now trying to do their best at uni, trying to make great choices and trying to be, not work themselves to to illness?
Yeah, I've heard this a lot from friends who sort of graduated, moved out on their own, but then moved back in with their parents during the pandemic. And there's this sort of weird dynamic that forms when you move back in with your parents, where it sort of reverts to the teenage years, where they are still very much the parent and you are still very much the child. And that's kind of weird if you're like 25 or 22 or something like that. And I think the families who I know of who have the healthiest relationships are the ones where the parents have managed to flip into the mode of, hey, we're all adults now. And it becomes less, I'm the parent, you're the child. And then you would sort of just genuinely treat the kid as if they are an adult, which they are, and not sort of, give unsolicited advice too much or like nag them too much to do things. It's just like you would treat them like a real adult rather than as a subsidiary of yourself, which I think is how a lot of parents view their kids. And there's a great book by Alfie Kohn called Unconditional Parenting. I'm not a parent yet, but I enjoy reading parenting books just because I think it's interesting and it teaches you a lot about life. But unconditional parenting talks about how, yeah, basically, even when kids are young, trying to approach that in a way where you're supportive of their feelings and supportive of their autonomy as much as is possible. Obviously, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have boundaries and stuff and healthy rules and things, but generally trying to be supportive of the kids' autonomy. I think the families who I know where the parents are supportive of the kids' autonomy, that's where the relationship thrives and where the kids actually want to hang out with the parents. Whereas if a parent's not supportive of a kid's autonomy and tries to push or coerce them into doing stuff, generally those relationships are kind of quite tense and a little bit fractured, at least from what I've seen.
I became a stepdad to a 10-year-old, and so I dived in as fast as I could. And the things that I learned about, to be honest, about the way that people learn when we're little. And, in the realm of the latest book you've written, how, when we're little kids, we're fantastically productive. And when we want shit, we get shit done, heaps of it. And then somehow we forget how to do that. It's kind of interesting. Is there something that we can see in our own kids that we can remember to do ourselves when it comes to being productive?
Mm, nice. Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is this idea of play. When we're kids, everything is play. We do things for their own sake. We explore. We take risks. Exploring and taking risks is part of growing up. But eventually, we get into the school system and we get told that, you're allocated the 15 minutes at 10 o'clock to play and 50 minutes at lunchtime to play. And after school, you got to make sure you do your few hours of schoolwork before you are then allowed to play. And even then, in a lot of different countries and places, like parents will be somewhat overprotective of their children playing outside and say, no, like there's all these risks associated with the outdoors, while not realizing that, like, there's way more risks online than there are than there are outdoors. If we can kind of find a way to remember what that exploration and what that play was like when we were kids, and try and find a little bit more of that sense when we're adults, that seems to hold the key to a lot of productivity and a lot of creativity. So the first chapter of my book is literally titled Play, and it's about how play is the most underrated productivity strategy out there, where, there's interviews with Nobel Prize winners and athletes and sort of super successful CEOs and stuff. And, often one thing that they cite is that they treat their work like play. They find a way to approach it in a way that's fun, that's enjoyable. And I was chatting to this executive coach a few weeks ago. We were at this retreat, and this guy is the coach to some of Silicon Valley's like top CEOs. He couldn't tell me who his clients were, but he said, you would probably recognize all of them. And he said one of his major mantras is that enjoyment is efficiency. If you're enjoying your work, you are going to be more efficient at it, which is really just the whole thesis of my book, Feel Good Productivity. If you can find a way to make your work feel good, if you can approach it in that spirit of play, you're naturally going to be more productive. You're going to be more creative. You're going to be less stressed. Enjoyment is efficiency. And so one thing that this guy, his name's Joe Hudson, one thing he says to his team members is, I don't want you to try and do it right. I just want you to try and enjoy yourself. And I guarantee that if you're just trying to enjoy yourself, you will do a better job than if you were trying to do a better job. So that's something that I've written that in the book. I've written a book about it, and I still struggle with this idea. But whenever I find myself doing something that feels hard or that feels like it's a lot of work, I'll ask myself that question: what would this look like if it were fun? How might I approach this in the spirit of play? And then generally, it becomes more fun, and I also become more productive, and my output is better for having asked myself that question.
Can I ask you for a real world example? Like, what was something that people would probably avoid, that they drag their, I don't know, like doing your taxes. All right, unless you can get an accountant to do it for you, you're sitting there, you're battling a website. It sucks. You're going through shoeboxes of invoices. It's normal. It's not fun. It takes way forever. What's a way? And you know that there's penalties if you get it wrong. So it's frightening at the same time. So what are some ways that to ask yourself that question: what would this look like if it was fun? Like, could you give us an idea of what that might be?
Yeah, so people always land on this example of like, what if not everything can be fun? Filing my taxes isn't fun. Doing admin isn't fun. What do I do about that? Well, what I would say to that is, yes, not everything can be 100% fun, but you can always find a way to make anything, like literally anything, even filing the taxes, you can find a way to make it 5 to 10% more enjoyable. So in my case, yesterday I had to do the equivalent of filing my taxes. It was like having to figure out some sort of financial disclosure, to figure out some sort of tax situation for the business. That's not particularly fun. How did I find a way to make it fun? Well, I decided, okay, this is a boring thing. If this were fun, I wouldn't be doing it at my desk. So I took my laptop and I went down to the local coffee shop, which is just like a couple of minutes walk from me, and I ordered myself a nice flat white. I was like, you know what? I'd rather be in a more cozy atmosphere while I'm doing this like tax situation rather than sitting at my desk. I had my headphones with me and I was playing some upbeat music. I think I was playing some like what was it? Some Take That and Westlife, just for fun because it sort of makes the thing feel a little bit better. I had a friend with me because I had a couple of team members and friends co-working at my house. So one of my team members, Saf, who's also one of my friends, I said, "Hey, Saf, do you want to come over to the coffee shop?" And he had to take a call, so he took a call from there. And so it's fairly basic stuff, but anyone can ask themselves the question of like, genuinely, if this thing were fun, or even just 10% more fun, what might that look like? For me, I think music is part of it. I think change of scenery. Sometimes if a meeting is boring, I'll find it easier to just sort of walk around and take it as a walking meeting. Appreciate that not everyone can do that. So what my whole shtick in the book and my kind of philosophy for productivity is, I kind of think of productivity as a very personal thing. Really, it's about running experiments and seeing what works for us. So for me, one thing that makes everything way more fun is just having film music from like The Lord of the Rings or Pirates of the Caribbean or whatever in the background. It just makes it more fun. What makes things more fun is having someone to work with, ideally in person, but even just online works. Back in the pandemic, I used to join this London writer salon where you would get on a Zoom call 4 times a day with a few hundred writers from all around the world. And being on a Zoom call with writers from all around the world while everyone is doing their writing just makes it a little bit, a little bit more fun. We've created a product that does this, Productivity Lab, where we get people in to do focus sessions with other people. We do like facilitated weekly reflections with other people on a Zoom call. That just makes it more fun. One thing that makes things more fun is taking things a little bit less seriously. So even though this tax situation is like, oh, it's kind of important that I fill out this financial disclosure because I kind of have to get it right, because if I get it wrong, I might get arrested for fraud or, all of this stuff. Even so, it's still worth approaching it with an attitude of, yeah, it's fine. It's sincere rather than serious. Yeah, I'm gonna try my best with this, but I'm not gonna over worry about it, because the additional worry that I add, the additional pressure I add to myself, does not actually improve my performance on the task. It just makes me more stressed, and chronic stress is generally bad for your life and bad for your health.
I really like that. There's another thing that you talk about, which unless you've learned it, and I was lucky enough to be taught this about 10 or 12 years ago. The idea of building systems into your life rather than having to rely on, oh, I'll remember to do that. Tell me, if you will, or for people who've never thought about what do you mean I build a system into my life? What can that look like, and how can that make someone become more productive?
One way that I like to think of myself as it relates to productivity is I am just a machine. And a machine not in the negative way, but I'm just a computer, and I will do whatever the program is designed for, and whatever program is written in as part of the machine. So if, for example, I find myself procrastinating from a task, I don't think that, if a computer was slow at doing something or took a while to start up, you wouldn't blame the computer. You wouldn't say this computer has no self-worth, this computer is a bit of a waste of space, like why is it procrastinating on this task? It would say, well, it's either a hardware problem or a software problem. Either the computer is simply not fast enough to cope with this task, which is these days is not usually the case. That's a hardware problem. Or it's a software problem. The way the system was programmed makes this task particularly slow. And given that I was into programming and stuff, I would always like, when you're debugging software, you're kind of going through and thinking, what is the tweak I can make to the system that's going to make this work more effectively? So in terms of systems for our own life, generally, if we're struggling with something, it's either a hardware problem or a software problem. The hardware problems are, have I had enough sleep? Am I eating reasonably well? Am I exercising every day? If those things are sorted, a lot of productivity problems will just take care of themselves. When I have 4 hours of sleep rather than 8 hours of sleep, I have a higher tendency to procrastinate because I have a hardware issue. But then we've got software issues. We've got things like, the other day I realized that, I was getting to bed quite late, like midnight, 1 a.m. And so instead of thinking, oh, I just need to get to bed on time, I was like, okay, what is happening in my life that's causing me to go to bed at midnight? And I thought back to the last 2 weeks, and I realized, well, I intend to go to bed at 10 p.m. But then as I'm getting ready for bed and I'm on the toilet, I start scrolling on my phone and I go on YouTube, and I end up watching YouTube videos until midnight or 1 a.m. Huh, that's interesting. Now at this point, God, I'm such an idiot. Why do I watch these YouTube videos? Why don't I have self-discipline? But I'm like, no, I'm a machine. I'm a system. And the system is designed to sort of seek out YouTube videos when it gets to 10 p.m. And so I thought, okay, how do I stop that from happening? And I downloaded an app called Opal, OPAL, for anyone who wants to download it, which just blocks YouTube on my phone after 9 p.m. So it blocks YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Reddit to circumvent that block using this app. So now it gets to 10 p.m. I sit on the toilet, I scroll to YouTube, and I'm like, oh, it's grayed out. Like I can't actually go on the YouTube app. And then I think, well, okay, cool. I might as well just, get ready for bed and read a book or something like that. And then I sleep on time. And so at every stage of my day, whenever I feel like I'm not being productive, and by productive, I mean I'm not using my time in a way that's actually intentional. Like I don't intend to spend 3 hours on YouTube. I just happen to spend 3 hours on YouTube. That's an unintentional use of time. I'll try and figure out what is a system I can add to my life, or what is something I can remove that would make this way easier to do, rather than flagellating myself or beating myself up for not being sufficiently disciplined.
And I think for many people, I guess it's the way we got brought up or whatever, that if you do sit on the toilet, not only will you have a sore bum, but, what are you doing tonight? I'm going to sit on the shitter and do 3 hours of just random YouTube. Great night. No, like none of us intend to do it. And we always feel a bit awful when we've done it. But we're never really taught that, by the time you're there, your ability to make the choice not to is impossible. So it's better to make the choice when you're not in that state. And similar things can be said around, like, I'm sober 14 years now, and so there's definitely choices I make when I'm not in a state where alcohol used to be a part of that. To make sure that when I do get to that place, that it's not an option. And it's certainly something that, as a doctor, you'd know this. You talk to your teenage kids about when they're going out. You're like, certainly if they start seeing, people that they're interested in sexually, you're like, well, how do you feel about it? Well, make a choice now, rather than when the hormones are flooding through your body and your body's just telling you everything about you need to have sex now. You can remember, actually, no, I thought earlier I didn't want to do this, and that's right. So I'll just say no thanks. Making the choice away from the situation is really, really important thing to understand. And it's once you start doing it, it's bonkers how much you get done.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I think that applies in a lot of other places as well, like where you separate the choice from the action. So, for example, one thing I find super helpful to do is to plan my day first thing in the morning. So, first thing in the morning, I have a document that I call my morning manifesto that just asks me a handful of questions that just encourages me to plan my day. And then once I've planned my day in the morning, it's like that's where I have clarity. I'm having my coffee, I'm maybe doing some journaling and planning my day. It takes like 5-10 minutes, but then I know what I'm doing for the rest of the day and I don't have to think too hard about it. Whereas on days where I forget to do that, or if I have like a meeting first thing in the morning and then it sort of gets derailed and then I forget to do it, there's like two parts of me that are trying to work. There's the part that's trying to figure out what the hell I actually want to do. And then there's the part that's trying to figure out how to actually do it. And then that becomes very difficult. And I tend to make choices that are not in line with my best self and are not intentional when I have to do the planning and the doing at the same time. So I think separating the choice from the action, separating the planning from the doing, works on a bunch of different levels as well.
We are bombarded. If you own a phone, you are bombarded, algorithmically bombarded, with imagery that tells you how you're doing okay, but look at this person who's nearly your age, maybe even a bit older, maybe even a bit younger. Look at them. They're hotter. They're shagging someone way hot, whatever. They're making more money. It's to be drawn in by the seductiveness of this idea. And certainly if you start being interested in, I don't know, for example, entrepreneurship or getting a small business loan, your algorithm will start feeding you, I get up every morning at 4:06, which is 10 minutes too late, and hustle and grind. Like, it's really seductive, this idea of just grind, grind, grind. What's your reaction when you see that kind of thing being shouted from the rooftops?
I kind of think that there are two types of advice. There is the advice that takes you from degenerate to baseline, and then there's advice that takes you from baseline to thriving. Now, I think if, for example, you're a teenage boy addicted to video games and a David Goggins-like figure tells you that the solution to your problems is to get up at 5 in the morning and go for a run, I think there is merit to that. I think for the teenage boy addicted to video games, actually getting up at 5 in the morning and going on a run while listening to David Goggins' motivational stuff is actually quite a good thing. It gets them from being a degenerate to at least being baseline. So that's pretty good. I think if you're already at baseline where you're reasonably satisfied with how your life is going, then the hustle grind to get to thriving, I mean, that tends to not be the thing that gets you to thriving. The thing that gets you to thriving is choosing the right game to play and playing it in a way that's enjoyable. It's easy with the whole like grind set mentality to approach life with a sort of mistaking activity for progress. Where okay, if I just wake up at 4 o'clock and just do the grind thing, then my business will go further or whatever. But usually, once you've achieved a certain level of success, the next levels of success don't come from putting in the grind. They become from choosing the right game and from playing it well. So I don't like to wholesale dismiss the grind set stuff, because I think it does have its place, in particular for the teenage boys who mostly consume that stuff. Because I know plenty of people that listen to David Goggins and grind set stuff and started going to the gym. And once you start going to the gym, you then start taking care of your diet. Once you start taking care of your diet and going to the gym, you feel more confident. Once you feel more confident, you then stop playing video games and watching porn as much. And it leads to a virtuous cycle. But so I think it's important to appreciate like who is the advice aimed at, and not. I don't think everyone should take the grind set philosophy wholesale.
Being aware of when you're at a point now where there's other stuff you need to do to now get the ideas to get to the next place, and this might be a thing that is difficult for some to understand. There's been a huge revelation at our home, Ali, in that a couple of months ago, my wife approved, bless her, that we get a sauna in our backyard. I've never been more creative in my entire life, because now I have anywhere between 30 and 45 minutes of just sitting there every day. And that kind of deliberate time to not be in front of a device, not be working, not be typing something out, not fixing something in my studio, which is always something to do, just sitting there, breathing. The things that come into my brain and the ideas I have are just profound. But that is I'm 50, right? It's a hard sell to someone who's like, oh, but I've got to keep going. All these people are successful. How do you tell someone that a part of being productive is to not do anything?
As you were saying that, so I've got a personal trainer session in an hour, and I've decided I'm going to go to the sauna after that, because I was thinking, oh damn, but I've got this presentation to prepare, blah 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 blah. So I should come home and start working. But actually, spending half an hour in sauna would probably be better for the presentation than me just coming back home and typing away on the presentation. So thank you for that. I will hit the sauna straight after the gym. I think people are often stuck in the model of like factories in the Industrial Revolution of like, if I just crank out more widgets, then my thing will be successful. And again, there are times in your life where that's true, but most business growth does not come from doing more of the things. It's very kind of like employee thinking. If you're like an employee at a company and you're like fairly new to the world of work, you think if I just work harder, they'll see how hard I'm working and they'll give me a raise. But you realize very quickly in the workplace that that's not how it works. The value is not created from the person who's just doing more stuff. The value is created from that one creative idea that takes the business, that 10x's the business. And those creative ideas that create a step change in performance, they tend not to come when you're at your desk. They tend to come when you're in the sauna or in the shower or having a walk, or just giving yourself space to allow the subconscious or the default mode network or whatever you want to call it, part of the brain, to actually function. So there's a middle way, as with all things. There's definitely a balance here. But I think it's worth asking, what's the game that you're playing and what is the next success of that game? In your case, waking up 5 hours earlier and cranking out more podcast episodes is unlikely to be the major thing that grows your podcast. You know, what grows a podcast? Well, it's getting a really famous guest on, creating loads of clips with good titles and thumbnails, and having a show that generally people recommend through word of mouth. If you've never done a podcast before, then yeah, for your first 10, 20, 30 episodes, it's good to get in the reps. Maybe working harder and doing more stuff is helpful then. But beyond that point, doing more reps and putting out more episodes is not the thing that grows a podcast, because no one is saying, oh my God, I wish my favorite podcast had more episodes, because like there's already too much content out there. So it becomes a creative task rather than a, I guess, productive task. I think I find it useful to keep that in mind. Well, whenever I'm in danger of going into grind set territory, I think, wait, is working harder on this actually going to lead to the result that I want, or is it some sort of creative breakthrough that's going to lead to the result that I think I want? And the creative breakthrough requires a hell of a lot of rest. So that's kind of how I approach it.
Since I was a kid, everything that shows up, like the fax machine, it's a time-saving device. You no longer have to go to the post office. Similarly, when Blackberries showed up, everything is like now, ChatGPT and Gemini, etc. It's a time-saving device. What, in your opinion, do you think is the one property that whatever time-saving device we're being sold, what do you think it needs to have to actually be a time-saving device?
Yeah, I think a lot of these devices save time. The problem is then what you do with the time that you've saved. So, for example, Gemini and ChatGPT help save time as it relates to banging out a first draft of a thing. There's a product that we're building internally as a team called VoicePal, which is in beta at the moment. And so you basically like talk into it, and then it will transcribe what you're saying and turn it into a first draft. So I write a weekly email newsletter. And so before VoicePal, that would have taken me 2 hours to sort of figure out what I want to say, type it out, blah, 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 blah. But after VoicePal, I can go for a walk. I can like talk into the thing. It can generate the first draft. And then I spent half an hour editing. So it cuts down the 2 hours to 1 hour for writing my newsletter. So it is a time-saving device in that this thing that once took 2 hours now only takes 1 hour. But then the question becomes, what do I do with that hour that I've saved? Now, usually I write my newsletter on a weekend, on a Sunday, because I leave it till Sunday to send. And so with that hour that I've saved, I generally chill out and maybe play on the PlayStation or maybe read a book. And so I think that's a genuine time save. And like it genuinely has saved my time, and that means like it means I can use that time on a thing that provides rest and relaxation and vibes, like reading or playing a video game. But if it was saving me time in my workday, and then that extra hour I was just using on more things that didn't actually move the needle, that were just busy work, that weren't addressing the bottleneck in whatever goal I'm working towards. Now it's like, yes, the device or the software or whatever has saved time, but I've just squandered the time that I've saved on something that's not actually moving the needle forward.
Why should we focus on being more productive? Why can't we just go, well, everything's fine, my job's fine, I'm doing okay. Why do I need to have a look at how I do my job or get my day done?
I don't believe in the word should. Like there are no shoulds. It's like you can basically do whatever you want. And so whenever I give productivity advice, I like to preface it, like if I'm giving talks and stuff, by saying that, look, this is not life advice. I don't know what I'm talking about. Like your life is very different to mine, probably. And your goals are going to be different to mine. So advice is only useful insofar as that it helps take you towards your goals. So if someone, for example, has the goal of being financially free and having enough passive income to fund their lifestyle, then, okay, once that person has decided that that is their goal, then you kind of need a bit of productivity to get there. You're probably not going to get to that goal by just chilling at your job and working 9 to 5 and then coming home and repeating the process and not thinking too hard about it. You probably won't get to the goal of financial freedom unless you're like a hedge fund manager or a job that pays you millions. That's if that is your goal, but it doesn't have to be your goal. And in many ways, where like I know a lot of people who are, as I'm sure you do, who are like super successful entrepreneurs, authors, people who specialize in giving advice about this sort of stuff. A lot of people eventually get to the idea of, you know what, actually, my life right now is really good, and I no longer need to strive for more. And that's a good place to be. I am sort of at the point where I'm like, you know what, life is pretty good, and I don't really feel the need to strive for more. I want to do it anyway because it's fun and because growing the business is sort of like playing a video game and it's just good vibes, and I might as well because I need to do something to pass the time. But I think it just really depends on what the goal is. One exercise I like to do with people when I'm having conversations is like a wheel of life, which is in the final chapter of my book, but you can also just Google it if you just search wheel of life. And basically the idea is that you go through like work, health, relationships in a few different categories, and you just rate yourself on a scale of 0 to 10 for how aligned you feel in that area, how much satisfaction you have in that area. And if your satisfaction is 10 out of 10 in all areas of life, amazing. You are literally living the dream. But if your satisfaction maybe on friends front is like 4 out of 10, you're like, maybe I could do with seeing my friends a bit more often. Now it's like, okay, cool. Now let's apply the principles of productivity. let's start putting shit in the calendar. Let's start sending out recurring calendar invites. Let's start a little spreadsheet of our friends so that we can keep track of who we've seen and like, oh, haven't reached out to Johnny in a while. Let me reach out to Johnny. Now productivity helps as a way of getting us to the goal, which is to help us be more satisfied with that area of life. So I think a lot of it just comes down to what is the goal, and then what specific productivity advice is helpful as a way of helping you get to the goal.
I would add that the knowledge that moving towards it releases those feelings of, hey, this is fun, or this is good, or I'm getting somewhere in a way that it otherwise doesn't. And there is, I personally, I find a huge personal reward of moving towards those things, even when I am just another person in a room of everybody who's as good as me, to go back to our, talk about early on in university days, when now you're suddenly one of many rather than the only one. It is moving towards those goals and the little adjustments I make in my own life, the tiny little wins that give me that little lift of like, oh, I nailed that, I figured that out, that's cool. And that gives me the incentive to do it again and again. And that's actually kind of fun. It's a nice way to work through your day. And regardless of whether it makes money or not, it's actually good. It's productive. It feels good to be expansive, I guess. But that's just my experience. Ali, thank you so much. You're a very busy man. And I can't thank you enough for taking the time to fit us in with your day. You're very busy, very productive, man. But thank you so much. Enjoy sitting in that sauna amongst the sweat and steam, getting those dynorphins pumping.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. This has been super fun, and I really appreciate you taking the time.